Hey, hey, I always want to jump off and say, this is the show, what else you got? But I always call my patrons Patreons. It is like, because the whole website's called Patreon, and then it's just immediate to call them Patreons. But no, the patrons are patrons, and the website is Patreon. I will get it right someday. Hello, patrons. It's me, your dorky person who runs this account. Today, I have a special guest with me, and her name is Nicole Eigener. Am I saying that right?
It's actually like a Z, like Eigener. But that was
Eigener.
close.
Yeah, I like that. That's also a really cool thing. Nicole and I were just talking about like actually meeting people that you talk to a lot online and stuff, and then you finally get to meet them. Is also learning how to pronounce their names because we don't hear the spoken name, the entire time that you're running into people on social networks. So
So
this
true.
is great.
Yeah.
So this is my friend Nicole, and Nicole is the author of a book called Beguiled by Night, which is, you explain. It's vampiric and it takes place in a very specific setting. So why don't you describe for the patrons what it's about?
Okay, well, here it is. If I can get the glare off. Beguiled by Night.
So beautiful. It's one of my favorite covers.
Thank you. I really love the way it came out, and I think it fits the book so well. But it's about a French vampire who lives in contemporary Los Angeles and suddenly finds his time unraveling, and he begins to go further and further backwards in time. And so the book is about how he deals with that, and also kind of touches on what it would be like from a really realistic standpoint to be alive that long, and how you
Yeah.
would deal with that, especially if things that you had become accustomed to in modern times were suddenly taken away from you.
Yeah,
So
that sounds like a really interesting concept.
it was fun to write. It was complicated to write too, with backwards timelines, but yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, we do understand in vampire lore that vampires become eternal beings. And so that's kind of part of the curse and the gift that tends to come up as a theme in
Right.
vampire fiction is this curse of getting to live forever, but also you have to live forever, which is like,
Exactly. It's a
you know,
double-edged sword. I mean, it
yes,
must, and then it makes personal relationships so complicated because do you just go around telling everyone you're a vampire, or do you keep it a secret and then
yeah,
watch all your friends and loved ones die? And
yeah,
it
that would
doesn't
be
sound that appealing, actually.
terrible. Yeah, no, I mean, I've often wondered, like, I mean, I'm recording. Sorry. Um, yeah, I've often wondered like how they go about with the whole friends and family thing. Like at some point you would become really detached in your relationships because you knew that you were going to survive them all. But also, I mean, like people live a long time, so I mean, like 90 years or whatever is a long time to know someone. So I don't
Sure.
know. It's interesting.
Yeah. So some of those situations are touched on in the book. Um, but I just I think for my vampire world, I really love to stick to kind of the more traditional lore. 'Cause I've read a lot of vampire lore over the course of my life. It's
Yeah.
like vampires are kind of my wheelhouse, I guess. And I brought a lot of that into the story. There's not a lot of sort of the contemporary things that are being applied to vampire stories are, they don't really work in my vampire world. So it's, he's very much a traditional vampire in the realm of you know Bela Lugosi's Dracula or Lestat, although Lestat wasn't exactly a traditional, not really. But there's no sparkling in my book. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe we should that would be fun because this video, so for 30 minutes we're going to talk about vampires, and I know that we can for much much longer, but for the sake of, people watching, maybe we should just kind of do like a brainstorm session of what we do know about traditional vampires, like what constitutes the traditional canon of what we know to be true about vampires. I mean, starting early on, like with Dracula, that was when we first started. For me personally, that was the godfather of vampire fiction. And there's definitely some rules that go along with that book for vampires. So what do you think are like the main maybe 5 elements of vampire life?
Well, it's really interesting with Dracula because the first film was so much a departure from the actual book.
Yeah, it was.
And I'm sure that most people, when they think of Dracula, they think of Bela Lugosi's Dracula.
Yeah.
Or Christopher Lee, like the early ones. But especially Bela Lugosi, probably more than anything. I mean, if you Google a vampire costume, it's going to look like Bela Lugosi's costume in the film.
Yeah.
But in the book, there's no mention of him not really being able to go out in sunlight. And Nosferatu was the first film that showed a vampire being killed by sunlight. So that kind of crept into the canon. But I love the mystique of that because vampires walking around in daylight, it takes some of their mystery away. They need to be shrouded by night, which is kind of where the title of my book came from, because night is like a shelter and protection for them.
Yeah.
They can accomplish more at night. So I would say definitely the sunlight thing is important to me.
The sun exists, staying in the darkness and not being able to go out into the daytime. Yeah. And then from a Dracula perspective, what you were saying, the Bela Lugosi, his Dracula, he turned into a bat, right? And that's not in Dracula.
Yeah. There were the mist and the bats, and then Bram Stoker's Dracula that Coppola directed took it even further and turned him into this werewolf character.
Yeah, he did. He turned into some kind of beast.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it depends on who you talk to, but vampires do have, the traditional vampire does have some sort of power. Like they can move really quickly, or they can turn into something else. And that is something else I didn't really explore in my book, though. He doesn't really have those kinds of powers, so he doesn't change into anything. But it's intriguing. I mean, that idea is intriguing, that a mystical being can just suddenly transform into something else.
Yeah, some shape-shifting powers.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, gosh, that could be a whole separate conversation. Where did the shape-shifting capabilities of vampires come from?
Yeah, when did that start? Because that is kind of part of it for some of it. I mean, Anne Rice's vampires, I think she took it to this whole kind of almost a rock star persona with a very sexy vampire. Whereas Dracula, especially even in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie, in the Coppola film, it was more of a brutality. I don't think they were trying to capitalize on Dracula's sexiness at all. Maybe his romance, but not really being sexy. But Anne Rice,
until Gary Oldman showed up in London,
Yeah.
Betty looks pretty good.
Yeah, that top hat, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
but yeah, that I think the first vampire text that made a vampire attractive was John Polidori's The Vampire.
I don't think I've read that.
It's it's really like sort of the precursor to Dracula in a way. I mean, somebody might disagree with me on that because vampire fans have a lot of opinions. But
Yeah, I'm sure there's Reddit.
but in the earlier ones and also in the lore, like vampires were hideous monsters, and they were usually like the result of some disease outbreak or something like that, and
Yeah.
they were not attractive. But John Polidori's vampire, Lord Ruthven, and I always pronounce that incorrectly, um, was wealthy and refined and described as rather handsome and attractive, and women were drawn to him. So I think he was the one who started the whole attractive vampire trope. But Dracula isn't really described as attractive in the book at all, in Bram Stoker's
Yeah,
book.
no. In fact, he was like a warrior, so he probably was like kind of thug like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then the mustache, the way Stoker describes his mustache, I picture this like weird, like Fu Manchu kind of mustache, and
Yeah. Yeah,
just
definitely.
yeah.
Um and then obviously the big one is that they're blood-sucking vampires, and that doesn't really change. That's usually like a constant thing. I mean, sometimes the vampire, like the teeth, kind of hang around and are there all the time, as like in in a different vampire lore, and then some of it is like almost a change. Like they go through like a change when they need to feed. Would you say that that's accurate? Like, how does your vampire have addressed the feeding?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because like Charlene Harris's vampires, they almost have like a snake like reaction, like their fangs like drop when they're
Yeah.
aroused or angry. And that was kind of a new thing for me. I don't think I had read that before in any other vampire lore or fiction. So I think that was something incredibly new that she brought in to the vampire canon.
Oh,
But
interesting.
but mine is his are permanent, but he does carry a little shame, I guess, and he doesn't want anyone to see his teeth unless like if you see his teeth, you're probably about to die.
I like that.
so so he's very reserved and um very unlistat. He doesn't like attention or being called out. Um but yeah, so his are permanent. And I don't know, that's an interesting thing. I feel like in my mind a vampire would have permanent teeth. Like I don't see how that could quickly change like from a biological standpoint, but.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just have like remember in Lost Boys, they always had like change. So
Yeah, they drastically changed. Like they looked completely normal. I mean, weird, but
yeah,
normal.
yeah,
And then when they again were aroused or angered or whatever, their eyes changed, their faces changed, their teeth changed. So
yeah.
it's
And it
almost
was
like a
interesting
werewolf
because
trope in that respect.
well, and it kind of goes along with the whole thing, the shape shifting thing that we were talking about, because
Yeah,
they also had like bat like feet and were hanging from
right.
in the
Yeah.
cave. So it was almost like as they were nocturnal beings, they were changed, but then they kind of stay in that state until I don't know, they go out at night and can like disguise themselves as just like average guys.
Yeah. Which I mean, I think would make it a lot easier for them to blend around amongst humanity
Yeah.
versus looking like that all the time, which their change states are more like some of the ancient vampire lore where they were more monster like. So it's kind of
Oh
an
yeah.
interesting combination. They have like the attractive side and then the monster side. And
Yeah, and they also, that movie played with like a lot of different lore in the sense of how to kill them,
yeah.
because there was a lot of introduction of like the Frog Brothers trying different techniques, with the holy water and the garlic and the stake through the heart. So, what do
Yeah.
you say is a classic um, method of disposing of a vampire? And I will say, actually, a new book called Rovers that just came out kind of played us off of the whole Lost Boys thing, where there's a motorcycle gang of vampires that's going around, and their like main focus is to eliminate other eternal beings, the other vampires. And
Interesting.
so, yeah, and they do it for like a bounty. So like, there's rival gangs of vampires and stuff. And so when they're killed, it's almost like a zombie type of thing. Like you have to cut the head off and then
Mm-hmm.
they turn into dust. So
I'm
what are some of the
definitely gonna have
methods
to check
that you
that
think
out.
are
That sounds
classic?
great.
No, you would like it. It is. It's really
It
good.
sounds really good. Well, I've always kind of had issue with the stake through the heart thing because, like, who wouldn't die from a stake to the heart?
Yeah.
Like, that
That
doesn't
you,
really seem like, specific to vampires. But again, if you look at traditional lore, and when people were scared that humans were coming back as vampires, it was usually disease related. The reasoning behind that was that if there was a stake through the heart, they wouldn't be able to rise again from death.
right,
So if
right,
you look at it that way, it totally makes sense. But
right.
literally nobody could survive a stake to the heart. But I think beheading is also like a pretty surefire way to prevent somebody from coming back.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think there's so many different ways that vampires die in movies, and I'm always sad when vampires die. I always want them to live.
Well, where do you think the garlic came in from? Like, what? How, can you source that back? Like,
Yeah, there's a lot of studies on garlic and wolfsbane because wolfsbane was also tacked up around doorways and windows and things to keep vampires out.
yeah.
And um, it's it's all tied into old like medical remedies, basically.
Huh.
Um, but supposedly, I'm ashamed I can't really recall the garlic thing, but wolfsbane um, would be spread around graves. It had something to do, realistically, probably with just the smell
Yeah.
of like decaying corpses. I mean, the thing is, like, now we're so sophisticated with technology and forensics and things like that, that some of these old remedies and solutions to things seem kind of ludicrous. But at the time when things were simpler and people didn't have Wikipedia or WebMD to go look things up, things were very practical. And so it was probably just an old herbalist recommendation. Sometimes it really is that simple. It's not like an exciting reason, but superstition ruled everything at that time, you know?
Oh, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, it's kind of the same time, like they didn't really know a lot about forensics and death and stuff. So, they were burying people and then thinking that, like, well, if they aren't really dead, like if we pronounce them dead and they were maybe just in a coma, maybe we should include like a little bell or something that they could ring and let us know that,
I
they're in
love
there.
the bell thing, but like I love that so much. But can you imagine how you would feel if you were just like, the cemetery worker and you were sitting
Oh my
there
God.
like that's the scariest thing,
Yeah, it
like
is.
one of
That's
the
such a
scariest things I've ever heard
yeah.
of.
Yeah, I know. I
But
actually was listening to a true crime podcast too, and they were talking about how they used to include it in their will, like, make sure I'm really dead. Like, if I appear to be dead and you're going to bury me, make sure I'm really dead, like maybe cut off my head or, make sure that you stab me in the heart because I want to make sure I don't come back.
yeah, well, I mean, it's so, those kinds of things were so in people's conscious at that time. And now we don't think about those things because we have science and embalming,
Yeah.
and, that's never a worry. But it was still such a mystery to people, even, 150 years ago or less. Like, people didn't know what was going to happen if you went to the other side. And they would do
Right.
anything to protect themselves. But, um, I think going back to the whole like disease thing with vampires, like they were exhuming people. And if they weren't decayed at all, obviously that body was getting up and walking around at night and terrorizing people.
Yeah.
Or, um, people would still bleed like months after they were born. I mean, it was just, they did a lot of really creepy stuff to these poor bodies. It's kind of weird, but they didn't give it a second thought. And another common practice with a suspected vampire was to shove a rock in their jaw. Like,
Oh, I heard about that as well.
yeah, like several years ago, maybe more like a decade ago, they exhumed this huge old graveyard in Ireland, and like multiple people in I think it was a mass grave, had rocks in their jaws. And so it launched this whole investigation into, were there suspicions of vampirism in that region at that time, because there were so many of them. So weird.
Well, what I heard about the rock in the jaw too was they were afraid, or like, no. So it started with exhuming a body, and the cadaver had bite marks, post mortem, maybe bite marks on their own body, and had like the contents of the stomach had its own flesh inside of its guts or whatever. So they assumed that the person like woke up and was either a vampire or was not dead and then was starving or whatever and tried to like eat itself and then eventually like died. Yeah, and so I think like
Wow.
then they started doing that rock thing so that they couldn't like eat themselves.
Oh my
That's what I heard.
God. Like folk horror is an endless wealth of horrific backstories. I mean,
Yes, amen
like,
to that.
oh my gosh. But if anyone is interested in like vampire archaeology, I totally recommend Tooth Picking's YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
He's
We'll link up to
great.
that in the
Yeah,
show.
he's really great. And he recently did an interview with an archaeologist who opened a suspected vampire grave in the northeast of the United States, which most of the vampire lore and legends came from Europe. So there aren't that many recorded instances in the United States, but he investigated one, and it was really interesting.
Wow, that is really cool. I mean, because there's some things too about killing vampires that I've always wondered about, like, especially the holy water one seems just kind of derived from a lot of faith in the church and in like religion to save you against, any kind of monster or trauma.
Right.
So I think that's probably where that came in.
Yeah, the same with crucifixes as well, because,
Oh yeah, that's one too.
depending on who you read, like some of Anne Rice's vampires are way older than Christianity, even. So, like, how could Christian symbols affect them? Like,
Oh yeah,
maybe
interesting.
not. So I think that's really fascinating. But Dracula 2000, I talk about film a lot because, you know, the films, they're so visual,
Iconic.
you know.
Yeah.
Um, but Dracula 2000, did you see that one?
Is
It's a Wes
that
Craven.
no, I didn't see that one.
It's very good. It's one of my favorite vampire films, but it
Okay, I'm
puts
gonna have
forth
to
this
add that to the list.
really crazy theory that Judas was actually the first vampire.
Oh God, I love that.
And so I know it's so good. And then it ties in. This is probably a spoiler. If you guys haven't seen this movie, like maybe don't listen to this part, but because it's kind of a spoiler. But it ties in that the reason vampires can't tolerate silver was because Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. I mean,
Oh,
I thought that was so cool.
yeah, don't you love that? I love when
Yes.
fiction and history kind of like come together like that. It's
I
really fun.
I absolutely love it. And it was kind of like a jaw drop moment for me when I first saw the film. So it's like,
Yeah,
what?
you're like,
I
yes.
mean, because the
Sorry about all
lore,
the noise too going on in the background.
it's
My
life.
bookshelves are being put together.
It's real
It's fine.
life. Yeah, so the silver thing, it's always kind of arbitrary. Like, why are vampires, affected by silver? Well, that's a
Yeah.
pretty good explanation, if you ask me.
Yeah, I love that. It's part of their like lineage from the original. That's very cool.
Yeah, yeah. I love those like long lineage vampire stories. They're so interesting to me. But
Have you read Andy Davidson's vampire novel? Now the name is escaping me. Wait, what the heck? Sorry, I have to look it up really quick. It's like do you know Andy Davidson on Twitter?
no, I don't. I'm making a list from this video.
Okay, so he just recently put out last year The Boatman's Daughter, but in 2017 he did In the Valley of the Sun, and
Oh,
it
okay. Yeah,
it is a
yeah.
very very good vampire novel. I highly recommend it. Look at this cover. I'm going to show you.
Yes, I remember seeing that. That's definitely going on my TBR
Yeah,
for sure.
you definitely need to read that. And Rovers is my other recommendation
I
for
just saw your
new.
review about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we
Well,
do have like a few minutes left. Oh, sorry. Did I just cut you
oh,
off?
no, that's okay. I was just going to say, I think it's so fun when people play with the vampire tropes. Like, I think sometimes they go like a little too far off the grid for me because
Yeah.
I'm just and that's just a personal preference. Like, I like the more like traditional vampire stories, but still they can go in different directions without losing all of that gloriousness that makes them mysterious vampires,
Yeah,
I
without scrapping the whole thing.
yeah, exactly. um I mean, there's one series in particular that I will think of, but I won't say it out loud. But um I I
I think I know what you're talking about.
I just tend to like interpretations of traditional vampire lore. I love that. And I think there's so much more room in the world for more vampire stories. Like, I want more vampire movies, more vampire books, everything. I mean, there's people love it. And there's a
Yeah.
reason people kind of identify with vampires, you know?
Yeah, I definitely think like there's the trifecta, right? Of like vampires and witches and werewolves. Like for
Yeah.
those three iconic like creature features, however you want to put it, like those are my three favorite. I mean, sometimes you could put zombie in to that list too, but I definitely just think like there could be more witches, more vampires, more werewolves. Never enough.
I totally agree. I mean, there's people love those kinds of stories. And um, you said something the other day about in one of your reviews about how the group of friends going to a haunted house or camping or
Oh
whatever is
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
a very common horror trope, but it can be interpreted in a million different ways. And I feel like that's another trope that it's just never going to go away because people are drawn to that. And I feel like it's the same with vampire stories or witches or werewolves, but it's like those stories can be retold in any number of ways,
yeah,
and people will always love reading them.
yeah. I totally agree. I think that it's the stories are as unique as the people telling them. So, I
Yeah.
mean, as long as your particular voice hasn't been heard on the subject, then go ahead and tell, because I doubt that it's going to be similar to someone else's, too close to it that we won't be interested. It'll be different enough that it'll be
Yeah.
unique to you. So
Yeah.
definitely tell the story.
Yeah, and like these kinds of stories have been around for hundreds of years, and people keep telling them. And so, whatever we can do to keep that alive, I think we should do it.
That's
More
amazing.
books.
That's a great way to like wrap up this segment. And also just a reminder that Nicole has that book Beguiled by Night, and we're going to be celebrating the year anniversary of that book this month. Beverly Lee and Nicole are going to get together and write something for the Nightworms blog. I think that you guys interviewed each other, correct? And that will be
Yeah.
part of the anniversary. Yeah, and then there'll be like a giveaway for a special edition of the book. So definitely celebrate the year anniversary of this book, and run out and get it if you like vampire novels. And really quick, tell us what you're working on for a future release. If you're working, I mean, I'm not saying you have to be working on something, but if you were,
Well,
what would it be?
I am actually. I never set off to write a sequel to this book because I wanted it to be a standalone book, which it is. It's like nobody would read this book and go, "It's a cliffhanger." Like it has an actual ending, but
Yeah.
I I can't let it go yet. Like I feel like there's more of the story, and I couldn't have written like a 500-page book. That's ridiculous for this
Yeah.
story. But so I'm working on a sequel for this book.
Wow. Yeah, that's
So
exciting.
it's very exciting, especially because I didn't. It wasn't my intention. It was like the story just kind of kept poking me. Like there's more to tell. There's more to tell, and so
That's cool. It's like the characters are telling you they have more to tell.
oh my gosh, I told someone else recently that I basically felt like my vampire secretary on this book anyway. Like he didn't behave the way I expected him to at all. So
That's awesome. I love that.
it's fun.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for taking
Thanks
time
for
out
having
to
me.
hang out. Yeah, it's really great to touch base with you and see you in real life. And yeah,
Yes.
definitely everybody look for more Nicole this month as she celebrates her year anniversary.
Yay. Thank you so
Yay.
much, Sadie. I appreciate you having
Absolutely. I'm going to end the broadcast, but stay put. And then everybody else, bye.
me. Bye.